Welcome to the 2020 Pasadena Festival of Women Authors online. I'm Nora Morley, the chairperson for the 2020 festival. Although we were unable to hold our event in person this year due to the coronavirus, we are so happy to present all 7 of our festival authors online in videos like this one. Our mission is to recognize the accomplishments of women authors, to advance community dialogue about literature, and to raise money for nonprofit literary programs. I want to thank the volunteers on our committee for all of their hard work. Since the first year in 2009, they have presented over 55 authors and have raised over $350,000 for grants to the community. With the proceeds of our 2019 event, we were able to make grants to the One City, One Story program at the Pasadena Public Library, the Pasadena City College Writer in Residence, Visiting Writer, and Summer Creative Writing programs, the Pasadena Senior Center Masters in Learning program, the Penn America Emerging Voices Fellowship program, and Writer. The signature of our festival is that our authors tell us their personal story, the story of their journey as a writer and as a woman. First, our author will be introduced by a member of our author selection committee. Then the author will speak about her journey. And lastly, there will be a question and answer session. Before we go to our author stories, I would like to thank our sponsors for their generosity. Our lead sponsor at the publisher level, Clifford Swan Investment Counselors, and our sponsors at the editor and novel levels. We hope that you'll consider making a donation and purchasing our authors' books through the links at the end of this video or by going to our website. And now, enjoy this author's story.
Hello, I am Mary Falver Holmes, and as a member of the Author Selection Committee for the festival, I am very excited to introduce Chia-Chia Lin with us today to share her debut novel, The Unpassing. The book was a finalist for the 2019 National Book Critic Circle's John Leonard Prize, shortlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, named one of the best books of the 2019 by Time, The Washington Post, and Esquire, and was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Lin herself was born in the United States and now lives in San Francisco with her husband, son, and soon-to-be new member of the family. She told me she signed the contract for The Unpassing while in the delivery room with her firstborn. And now, as she is expecting her second child, well, I haven't asked if she has a new book pending, but I hope so soon. The story is set in a rural area near Anchorage, Alaska, and the geography and scenery are as important a part of the reader's experience as they are for the characters in the book. The plot centers around an immigrant Taiwanese family who struggle with their isolation in Alaska, a setting that does not welcome them easily. The intensity of the emotional landscape is heightened by the story's presentation from the 10-year-old boy's point of view. The parent-child bonds and connections are presented from a very stark perspective. The mother in The Unpassing is neither warm nor nurturing to her children, and she also expresses significant displeasure with her husband. The title, The Unpassing, is filled with ambiguity and is open to various interpretations. It can be seen as the family's failure to pass as Americans in their new home country, or the realization that the passing across the ocean cannot be undone, or the dramatic scene at the beginning of the book where the mother fakes her own death. How many stories do you know where, in the opening scene, the mother pretends to die right in front of her children in order to toughen them up so they will be able to cope with life's harsh realities? As I said, the emotions in this book are raw and palpable, and the reader shares in living them. We thank you, Chia-Chia, for joining us for our virtual festival today. Please tell us about your journey as a writer and how it led to The Unpassing. Welcome, Chia-Chia.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much for that intro. And I also want to add thanks to the Pasadena Festival of Women Authors. for having me speak today. I'm really excited to be included in this lineup of such amazing writers.
We are so glad you could join us. Thank you.
I wish we could have done this in person, and that I could have met all of you and all of the lovely volunteers in person and more intimately. But, you know, I guess these days we have to do things out of our offices, and mine is actually in my garage. So I'm only showing a little corner of it here.
Well, you have a lovely garage, and we are so glad that you can fit us in to your garage, if you will. It's not quite the ballroom, but maybe it'll be even better. Thank you for coming.
When my book, The Unpassing, was about to be published last year, I didn't give my family advance copies of my book, or even any of the hardcovers that were stacked up in my garage, but they found copies on their own. The week my book came out, my mother, who doesn't read English well, and as long as I've known her, has never touched a book of fiction in any language, she said, "There's something bothering me about your book," which, of course, are the exact words to say if you'd like a writer to die from dread. I didn't respond because my policy, both then and now, was to become basically catatonic when my book was mentioned. My mother said, "There's a sentence that says, 'Land was given to this family by the Japanese and taken away by the Chinese.' But that's not true," she said. "My family had some land taken, that's true, but it wasn't given to us by the Japanese." She was referring to a sentence in the first chapter of my novel that was almost an aside. And, you know, maybe because I wasn't responding, or maybe because she was trying to say something that I was too dense to hear at the time, she said the same thing about 4 more times. "It's not true," she kept saying. "It's not true." Finally, I said something to the effect of, "This book isn't about our family. It's not about us at all." And I've continued to say that from May of 2019 on, and you know, now it's more than a year later, and I said it to my sister and maybe my brother, and I said it in interviews and book events. And when you say something that many times, you know for sure there's a lie in it. There are scenes in the book that my family will recognize. Not many, but a couple. But more than that, even as I've intentionally changed the facts of the novel to drive the story far away from my own biography, I'm aware that somehow at the same time, it's kind of honed right in on my childhood. The book is about my family. It's about how we talk to one another, or rather didn't talk to one another, and the messiness of people with very different desires and needs crammed into one space, and the attempt to sort of create a life together that way in a new land. So when asked about how my book came to be, about, you know, the journey to the writing of this book, I think that has to be one of the answers. That the real journey was, you know, living my childhood and then learning over many, many years how to look at it through fiction, through a totally different set of characters and circumstances, and arrive at truths that I hadn't seen before. And my other answer, kind of about my writing journey, you know, how I ended up here, is a little bit longer and more convoluted, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. And I'll start by telling you about the reviews of my book, which I realize is a really strange thing to do, but bear with me for a second. So for those not comfortable with uncertainty, the weeks around your publication date of your first novel are an extremely uncomfortable place to be. You know, the unknowns aren't just limited to whether the New York Times or the LA Times will choose to review your book. and by extension, whether anyone will have ever heard of your book. And it's not just what those 5 or 6 paragraphs will say, whether they'll affirm your life's work or shake your confidence in it, but also, whether there will be any reviews at all. So if you know any writers, you'll know tales of immense grief and unfairness, as well as fairness and triumph about this whole stage in the publication process. And in my own case, I looked out. There were reviews, and they were pretty uniformly positive. I was really grateful, and it's really impossible to overstate that relief. But, once the relief had subsided, I started to notice something interesting about the reviews. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that something like 6 reviews came out in a row that all used the word bleak. They usually had an adverb attached to it, relentlessly bleak, unremittingly bleak. One review used the word bleak no less than 4 times. And I've been thinking about this ever since, because it's a strange word to have appear repeatedly and nearly without fail in reviews that are actually pretty positive. And so my first, line of questioning when something like this, am I a bleak person? Is my worldview bleak? Because I was caught off guard. When you write a book, you don't really know what it is. It's so many things to you. It's everything that you are. And the act of writing a book is a kind of question to the world. What is this? What am I making? And reviews are interesting because suddenly out of that void come answers. And what I was hearing was, you wrote about Alaska, you wrote about immigrants, you wrote something bleak, 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 bleak. And I still remember early on, I visited a book club, the only book club I visited because I knew some people in it. And when they asked me to talk about what I thought the book was, I said, I think it's funny. And I looked around, and every single face was staring back at me, utterly bewildered, and maybe even a little bit frightened. And then one poor soul was like, I guess there was that one paragraph where the kid gets on a rope swing. I guess that was a little bit funny. Is that what you mean? And I should add that this book club was part of my city's Mothers Club. And my book begins with the death of a 4-year-old child and sort of documents an unraveling family. But I do honestly think there are funny moments, not slapstick funny, but there are quirks and incongruences and weirdnesses and ironies. And all of that is funny to me. This is the kind of thing that I delight in, both when I'm writing and reading, this opportunity to kind of look at things on a slant. And now, as I'm partway into what I hope will be my second book and have more distance from my first, I think that what those reviews and what many readers were latching onto in the Unpassing is the trajectory of the story, the shape of it. We're used to these immigrant stories with an upward path, tales of survival and overcoming hardship and the building of a new life, a new way forward. And I knew from the outset that I wanted to write a different story, one that explores failure and specifically what failure looks like when there aren't so many safety nets. Is failure depressing? Is it cheerless and bleak? Yeah, sometimes. But I think, sometimes it's more than that. I'm turning 40 this year, so I imagine that I'm a little bit older than the average debut author. I don't know, every one of whom I just imagine to be 21. And by this point in my life, I've quit and or failed at a good number of relationships and endeavors and jobs. I've worked in New York City as a lawyer. I've tried making and selling jewelry. I've written extremely technical reference guides for software developers. And in one job um, I had to occasionally travel to luxury hotels and casinos in China and pretend to be a high roller to evaluate the luxury services that I received, kind of like an amped up secret shopper. Um, it was very extreme. I had fake business cards and I wore basically like a wire. And I was also supposed to pass myself off as a Chinese guest, not Chinese American, but Chinese, when my Mandarin skills are passable at best. Um, it was a ridiculous thing to ask of me, but I did it anyway. And I was very, very bad at it. Um, I'm actually the sort of person who, on a good day, is already chock full of anxiety and fear and feelings of inadequacy. So, what all these relationship and career stops and restarts and unfamiliar situations amounted to is that often enough, I found myself feeling completely, overwhelmingly in over my head. Um, I'm going to pause on this phrase, in over your head, because it just seems especially apt to me. The feeling is terrible. It feels like drowning, but it's also a full immersion. When you're in over your head, you're also, in some sense, fully immersed in some of the possibilities and offerings of life. And it's during these times that you're forced to reevaluate, what am I doing here? How did I get here? Where should I go from here? And I think people often think of failure as a U-turn or as, backtracking on the progress that they've made. And they would like to neatly excise that part of their lives if they could, the part of it that has moved backwards or lost ground. But in fact, points of failure seem to me to be the points at which, the trajectory of your life, which up to now has been a line, a continuous line, suddenly jumps and starts a completely new line somewhere else. And sometimes I think failure works like this. You arrive at some understanding about yourself, a discovery that you've come to the end of a particular road. And, going back to that secret shopper job that was sending me to China, um, after a particularly harrowing trip to Macau, where I was gambling at high limit tables and watching, I think, like $1,000 go by every hand, every minute, I had a kind of breakdown. So much money was being thrown around, my entire annual salary at one table. And I was drinking and timing, how long it took to be offered another cocktail and trying not to get so drunk that I couldn't keep track of the time. And I had to make some crazy requests and act extremely demanding because that's how you test the service in a luxury property where, guests can sometimes be quite entitled. And I think I reached some kind of limit on how much cognitive dissonance I could handle, or in how far from my real personality or comfort zone I could stretch myself. And, that was when I finally took the steps to go back to school for writing. And soon after that, I quit that job. Um, and even before that, I found myself in Alaska, where my book is set in much the same way. I just had a strange year. This was 2004. A long relationship had ended. I'd finished my first year of law school, a year of being immersed in a world that didn't really fit me. And I ended up working in Anchorage for a summer. I couldn't explain it to anyone exactly what had driven me there. I'd never been to Alaska before, and I knew very few people at the time who had. What was I looking for? I didn't know. But the funny thing is, though I didn't know what I was looking for, once I was there, I knew I'd found it, this sort of new thread in my life. And I wanted to spend, a little bit of time talking about Alaska because that setting really became sort of infused into every single page of my novel. And that summer, I rented a basement apartment in Anchorage. And every day after I got out of work, at 5 p.m., there were hours and hours of sunlight remaining. So I would walk, the edges of a nearby lagoon, or I would head for the coastal trail or the Chugach Mountains. And I felt like I was getting away with something. I was living 2 days for the price of one. I would have my work day, and then I would have my hiking day, and then it would be nighttime. And at the end of the summer, I set out into the back country of Denali National Park with two friends. And by that point, it was my third time to Denali, but my longest backpacking trip of the summer. And though we were on foot, we covered enough ground over those few days that the landscape was in constant flux. You had tundra, then there was a lake, and then you had forest, and then tundra again, and then mountains. And we encountered moose and bears and caribou and Dall sheep. And the landscape was just sharply, unendingly beautiful. And there was really nowhere to turn to sort of look away from it. And we exercised what I thought was a lot of caution and shared this really healthy, I think, fear of the forces of nature. And yet we repeatedly found ourselves compromised. We discovered that glacial silt can act like quicksand. We made repeated river crossings in this freezing glacial melt, only to discover that that it was deeper in the middle than we'd expected. And once we had to make camp near a bear and a cub because of a river crossing like this that was too high until morning. And then we got lost. With trail hiking, the questions are limited. Is this the right path? Which fork should we take? But in the backcountry, the questions really add up and have almost, it seems, no end. Should we go forward or backward or right or left, or any of the degrees in between? Where did that mountain come from? Will we ever see another human being? And what had happened to us was that the river that we thought we were following on our map had dried up in real life and sort of vanished. And it was, there was no clear river there. And instead we had mistakenly followed the twists and turns of a smaller river or tributary until it finally dawned on us that we were very badly lost. And my two friends became quiet. And, I just remember the quietness more than anything else. And in this new strange silence, we scrabbled up and down mountainsides, tripping, turning our ankles, trying to find this river on our map. And we spent, I would say, like a good day and a half just steeped in uncertainty. It doesn't, sound like much maybe, but that fear felt, timeless. It felt like it had no end. And Alaskan backcountry is truly a place with no safety net, no walls, no sense of enclosure or intimacy or kinship with other human beings. It's a place of exposure. And all the confidence that I had in myself kind of melted away. And I found myself thinking over and over during that trip, and for years after, who was I in a place like that? And I think this one trip in which I repeatedly found myself floundering, almost as much as the entire summer that I was living in Anchorage, helped me write the Unpassing. Not just, the descriptions of the setting in Alaska, but the mood and the explorations and the obsessions of that book. And, I don't mean for this to be sort of an inspirational talk about learning from your failures or getting up and trying again. I'm not really the sort of person who feels the desire or the ability to inspire anyone. I only mean to say that The Unpassing is ultimately a book about failure, and that failures are immensely interesting to me. There are moments of instability and saturation, and they're a turning point. And in my own life, you know, a few of my own small failures led me, I think, to write this book. In terms of its plot, The Unpassing is basically a series of failures, and much larger ones at that. And, you know, maybe it is bleak to fixate on these moments that are often the moments of our greatest pain or angst or unease or humiliation. If it is bleak, I guess I embrace it. You know, for me, these moments are rich moments full of change and depth and feeling and searching and the sensation of being on the cusp of something utterly unknown.
Wow, Chia-Chia, that was amazing. I had no idea kind of journey you were described, and yet I feel like I've been to Alaska and back, and understand a little bit what bleakness you mean and lived. You answered a lot of questions for me as I think about my reading of the book, and I'm sure that you stirred up a lot of questions also in our audience. So if you don't mind, I'd like to take a little more of your time and ask the audience to share some of their questions. Our first question comes from Akila.
Thank you, Mary. My name is Akila Gibbs. I'm the Executive Director of the Pasadena Senior Center. Chia-Chia, I loved your book. It was beautifully written. I particularly liked how you depicted the family's journey and intersection between community and identity. But I'm wondering, how did you come up with the title Unpassing, and what does it mean?
Thank you, Akila, for reading the book. That, you know, as far as the title goes, I wanted a title that left a lot of space for interpretation. And, you know, I'm never the sort of person who wants to dictate, you know, one specific meaning with a title or with anything really. And, you know, as Mary said earlier in her intro, you know, I did want to gesture at this notion of like the passage across an ocean, and the fact that later the family feels like they can't really go back to the place that they came from because of everything that's happened to them. So in that way, there's sort of like an unpassing. And I also wanted to gesture to the death of Ruby, the youngest child in the book, because, you know, it happens at the very beginning of the book, and then each individual family member sort of goes off on their private sort of individual journey of grief, which looks very different, I think, for every family member. And there's a way in which she never really passes away for some of them. And so I did want to gesture to that as well. But I also just really like un words, you know, words with un in front of it, because I feel like it's more often than just a negation of a word. You know, like if you think about the word untell, often there's this kind of connotation that you can never untell something, you can never unspeak it. So there's this feeling of, I think, irreversibility and kind of this like haunting feel to unwords that I kind of like as well.
Well, you did a great job, and I carried Ruby's death throughout the whole novel. I mean, she lived in my heart. So thank you for sharing this wonderful novel with all of us. I truly enjoyed it. It was wonderful.
Thanks.
Michelle, I see you have a question for Chia-Chia.
Great, thanks, Mary. Hi, Chia-Chia. Thank you for being here and joining us today. I'm Michelle Pereira, and I'm the director of the Pasadena Public Library. And I'm really thankful for you being here today and for us to get to participate in this. You gave a really insightful talk and gave us a glimpse into your personal life and your journey. Could you expand on that a little bit and tell us how has motherhood really affected your writing?
Yeah, sure. You know, the easy answer to this that I'm sure any of you could guess is that I have a lot less time. And, you know, and I do sometimes think, you know, about my friends who don't have children and who are writers, and I envy them a little bit for their time. But if I'm being completely honest with myself, before I had a kid, it's not like I was writing 10 hours a day, I mean, it was more that I would try to write 10 hours a day and then end up writing for, 50 minutes. And the rest of that time was just spent staring at the screen, trying to muster confidence to go on and just sort of agonizing. And so on my good days, I like to think that the time that I've lost because I'm a mother now is actually a lot of that kind of sort of self-doubt time and that, the actual writing time might actually, come out to be about the same. I'm not sure. On bad days, I do really feel like I just don't have enough time to do anything. And I think that's just, what any parent would feel about work. But, on a sort of deeper level, I'm really interested in writing about families. And I want to keep writing about families, though maybe not always from a child's perspective. And up to this point, I've really only had one family as a reference point, from which I draw, all of my memories. And now, I feel like my life has been enriched somewhat in this respect, with a different perspective. It is really different to be a parent than to be a child or a sibling. And I hope that that will, inform some of my works in the future.
Thank you. And I hear congratulations is in order.
Yeah. So, maybe less time.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Sophia.
Hi, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a student at Sarah Lawrence College, and I'm also a Wright Girl alum. Thank you so much, Chia-Chia, for your fascinating talk and for taking the time to be with us today. Today, my question, I'd like to ask about the theme of space exploration that's woven throughout the story. And I was wondering if you could explain why the family is so interested in the topic, especially the Challenger explosion.
Hi, Sophia, and thanks for being here. Though I don't actually know that much about astronomy, I found that I like people who like it. My husband is an aerospace engineer, and so, a lot of his coworkers and some of our friends are as well. And I've noticed this kind of thread of optimism, or I would say almost like innocence, in people who are captivated by space exploration. Like it's this part of them that, no matter what else happens in the world, they can never be disillusioned about this. It's like a part of you remains a child who wants nothing more than to fly. And so there's something about it that I find, just to be kind of intriguing. And in this particular story, it just seemed fitting for me, especially with the father's personality, because the father is sort of a big dreamer and he thinks big. And even though he's not so great at executing, and he just kind of flops on a lot of things that he tries, he still kind of like has this way of thinking. And so I wanted to sort of attribute that to him. And I also knew that I wanted this novel to take place over the course of the year of 1986. That was a year when oil prices tanked. And so there was a big recession in Alaska. And, once I had decided to give the father this space obsession, and I knew that I was writing about 1986, I kind of had to address the Challenger explosion. And I was really reluctant to do that because it's such a big event in history and it's been written about so many times and it lives in our, in the public imagination already. I just felt like, what could I possibly add to this? And so I didn't want to do it, but just the year that I'd chosen in this circumstance, I just kind of had to make myself do it. And so in the end, I kind of had this explosion happen in the same week as Ruby's death. And I didn't think it was going to work. It's just one of those things that you just write and you think you're going to immediately throw away. but I ended up keeping it. I decided that it kind of added to the family's sense of disorientation, and that I kind of liked having this public tragedy kind of, overlaying this private tragedy. And so I just left it that way. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. That's really smart and really innovative. And I think you pulled it off incredibly. So thank you so much.
Christine, I see that you have a question for Chia-Chia.
Thank you so much, Mary, and I enjoyed your presentation so much, Chia-Chia. My name's Christine Reeder, and I'm a librarian with the Pasadena Public Library. Your writing is absolutely beautiful, and I'm very interested in how you decided to write the book from a 10-year-old boy's point of view.
Hi, Christine. Yeah, it's funny because people often think of a child's point of view as kind of easier to write. Like it's simpler language and simpler thoughts. But for me, I just felt like there were a lot of sort of exciting possibilities, and that there's opportunity for richness and texture that you don't often get with adults. So I guess what I mean is that, children can create their own stories, their own myths and realities and belief systems based on what's happening to them. That can be a little bit stretched. And it's because, people don't talk to children the same way. They often they sort of elide information. And so that leaves a lot of space for interpretation. And also, I think that children are more in touch with their bodies. So for example, the narrator in my book never says at one point that he feels a lot of dread, but he instead says that, something's stuck in his throat and he can't get it out. And so it almost feels like there's opportunity to be more poetic sometimes with children. And their emotions are just more on the surface, their moods are elastic. Like I know, my son will be laughing and then crying and then laughing again, like within, a span of 10 seconds. And it's just a lot, I feel like, for a writer to work with. And in addition, there's a sense of mystery, I think, because, I think the point of view of a child is complex. People are always simplifying things for them, but children will turn it, so that reality gets turned just a few degrees, and they interpret, what's happening to them in an equally complex but just different way. And I like those gray areas. I think I thrive in them. And so for me, a child's point of view felt like the right point of view for this book.
Thank you very much, Chia-Chia. You helped explain it, and from the boy's point of view, fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Amanda, you have a question for Chia-Chia?
Yes, thank you so much, Chia-Chia, for coming and speaking to us virtually. My name is Amanda, and I am a poet, and I'm an alumna with Write Girl. And my question was how you came up with that striking opening scene where the mother stages her own death in front of her children.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi.
So, there's like a really short answer to this question, which is that it happened to me when I was young. And it happened in sort of a much the similar way. And, when my mom was carrying a plate of grapes and it just kind of collapsed in the living room. But, and, it wasn't until much later that I kind of thought back to it and was like, that was kind of a strange thing to do. And the longer sort of answer to that question is that scene came maybe like about a third of the way through the book, initially in the first draft. And I, instead what was the opening is what actually comes after that scene, where the book is talking about, an introduction basically to the family. The father's a plumber. They live in South Central Alaska on the edge, in this kind of like rickety house on the edge of a spruce forest. And I started to feel like it felt too much like a beginning, if that makes any sense, that it was sort of like announcing itself as an introduction. And so I wanted something that kind of pulled the reader in more like an anecdote that just felt like you were kind of dropped into this family without any sort of explanation. And so as an experiment, I took that scene and I put it at the beginning, and it worked for me, I think, because it felt like that one small occurrence kind of gestured to the entire book, that it felt like kind of like the whole book was in a way contained in that one scene. Because, you know, I added this part where, you know, the narrator's thinking that it was so easy for the mother to be dead and then to come back to life, you know. And I wanted that to be kind of a theme in the book. And so I left it as the beginning.
This has been really interesting, and I've enjoyed all the questions and all your answers. I have just one last question for you, Chia-Chia. You spent a lot of time in the story and in your presentation describing and sharing the Alaskan scenery and landscape and the outdoors. But you also spend a lot of time with the families inside the family's house. And I wondered if you could explain sort of the contrast or the complementary roles of the interior and the exterior settings that you describe in the novel.
Yeah, sure. You know, I'm asked a lot, as you might imagine, about the landscape outside in the book,
Sure.
you know, South Central Alaska, the spruce forest, the coasts. But the truth is, I am actually equally interested in life indoors, you know, within the walls, and how the interior landscape of a house can be kind of a frightening setting as well, you know. I wanted there to be this large contrast, you know. Outside, it feels like sometimes there's nobody out there, you know. And within the house, it sometimes feels like, you know, the presence of other human beings is almost too deeply felt. You know, sometimes it's inescapable. And, you know, I wanted to play with these questions of what does it do to us to be uncontained and then to be contained. And I think about it, especially now too, sort of, you know, we're all in our houses, or I don't know about you, but I am in my house right now during this pandemic, pretty much 24/7. And I think about this, my own house as a setting kind of sometimes, you know. I think it feels to me like we're wearing down the house at a faster rate, you know, because we're living in it so much. And I'll watch my son sort of ride his toy train back and forth between the kitchen and the living room, and he's scratching up the floor. And then he likes to do this thing where he's like ramming the train into the front door, and there's dents all over it. And I just feel like, you know, this crazy era right now that we're living through is being like etched into the walls of our home. And there's something about that that feels just interesting to me. And I think, you know, I obviously wrote this book before the pandemic, but that sort of questioning, I think, is something that I was really interested in, you know, and how, you know, the indoors just feel so wild sometimes, you know, as wild as outside, and how boundaries can start to dissolve. So yeah, thanks for asking that question.
No, that is fascinating. And you're right, we're struck by the overwhelming beauty and presence of the outdoors, of the indoors. And as you said, right now, we're really living indoors. And it certainly showed and was palpable in your book as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mary.
This has been a great session, and it's been a wonderful opportunity to host everyone. But before we sign off, I just want to take a minute and thank our guest Zoom audience for joining us as well. It's been a pleasure to host the conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it too. We ask, if you feel it in your spirit to move you, that you support our mission for the festival, and perhaps enjoy more books and buy copies of our books from the links that at the end of the video or on the PFWA website. And we wish you all well. Thank you so much for joining us.
And I just want to add thank you to everybody who showed up today. You know, I haven't seen many people in the last few months, and it's really, really nice to see such friendly faces and to get to talk about my writing. So thank you.
Thank you, Chia-Chia.